Ethan Cross leaned against the courthouse railing with his arm draped around Vanessa Cole's shoulders and laughed. Not a quiet laugh. Not an embarrassed one. He laughed the way men laugh when they believe they have already won. Loud and careless, and aimed directly at the woman standing 10 feet away from him. "You're going to call me in a week," he said to Claire, loud enough for everyone in the hallway to hear. "Maybe 2, but you will call." Vanessa smiled beside him, red lipstick, pressed blazer, the kind of woman who enjoyed watching other women lose. Claire said nothing. She picked up her bag, turned and walked through the courthouse doors without looking back once. And that should have been the moment Ethan felt something. Some flicker of doubt. Some instinct that told him the silence wasn't surrender. But he didn't feel it. He just watched her go and assumed that was the end. It wasn't. It was the beginning of everything he would eventually lose. If this story already has you hooked, hit the like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Stay with me all the way to the end, because what Claire did next is the part nobody saw coming. The morning of the divorce finalization was gray and cold. The kind of morning that feels like the sky has already decided what kind of day it's going to be. Claire Bennett arrived at the Hartfield County Courthouse at 8:45, 15 minutes early, wearing a charcoal wool coat she'd owned for 6 years and a pair of low heels that she'd bought on clearance from a department store downtown. She carried a leather portfolio case and a paper cup of coffee she'd picked up from a cart on the corner, and she walked through the courthouse doors with the composure of someone who had already done all her grieving and had nothing left to perform for anyone. She had, in fact, been done grieving for longer than she could precisely remember. Her attorney, a composed woman named Sandra Yee, who had handled Claire's paperwork with remarkable discretion for the past 14 months, was already seated in the corridor outside courtroom 6. Sandra stood when she saw Claire approaching, looked her over once and said, "You sleep?" "A little," Claire said. "Good enough." Sandra took the portfolio from her and tucked it under her arm. "His side is already in there. He brought her." Claire didn't ask who. She already knew. Ethan had been with Vanessa Cole for somewhere between 18 months and 2 years, depending on which lie you believed. Claire had stopped calculating the timeline around month 4 of the investigation she'd quietly commissioned, when the particulars stopped mattering and the pattern became the only thing she needed to see clearly. Vanessa was 31, an account director at the marketing firm where Ethan worked as a regional sales manager. She was attractive in a deliberate way, the kind of woman who understood her appearance as a professional asset and maintained it accordingly. Claire bore her no particular malice. Vanessa hadn't made vows. Ethan had. Inside courtroom 6, the proceeding was brief and procedural, the way legal endings always are. Nothing like the marriage itself, which had been large and full of noise. A judge reviewed the settlement terms. A clerk noted the date for the record. Signatures were applied to the appropriate lines. Claire signed her name 4 times, each stroke clean and unhurried. When the judge said the marriage was dissolved, Claire nodded once, the way you nod when a meeting has concluded and there is nothing further to discuss. Ethan, seated across the table with his attorney and Vanessa Cole positioned 2 rows behind him in the gallery, could not seem to stop himself from looking at Claire with an expression she recognized. The smug reassurance of a man who had convinced himself that the pain was entirely on the other side of the table. He'd been wearing that expression for months, every time their attorneys communicated, every negotiation he'd tried to use as leverage. He thought she was desperate. He'd thought that for a long time. In the hallway afterward, when Sandra was still inside gathering documents, Ethan approached her. "Claire." He said her name the way you say something familiar that you've already decided has no further value. She looked at him. He had his hands in his coat pockets, Vanessa standing a careful half-step behind his right shoulder, and he smiled at Claire with the particular condescension of someone delivering a speech they'd rehearsed. "I hope you know this is the best thing for both of us," he said. "Honestly, I think you're going to see that, eventually." Claire considered him for a moment. He was 43, still put together, the kind of man who aged in a way that other people called distinguished, and he knew it. He'd always known exactly what he looked like, and had organized a meaningful portion of his identity around it. "Okay," she said. He waited. When nothing else came, the smile tightened slightly. I want you to be fine. Genuinely. I am fine, Ethan. I know you think that right now. I don't think it, she said, not unkindly. I know it. There's a difference. Something moved behind his eyes. Not regret exactly, but the early edge of confusion. He'd been expecting something else. Tears, maybe, or anger, or at minimum a longer speech from her side of the argument. He'd had a response prepared for all of those. He didn't have a response prepared for this. Vanessa touched his elbow. Babe, she said quietly, let's go. But Ethan wasn't quite finished. He laughed, that loud, careless sound, and looked back at Claire with something that was trying to be pity. You've got the apartment for another 30 days, right? You should probably start thinking about where you're going after that. Claire picked up her bag from the bench where she'd set it. I already know where I'm going, she said. Take care of yourself. She walked toward the exit. Behind her, she heard Ethan say something else, something lower, directed at Vanessa, and then Vanessa laughed. Claire didn't turn around. She pushed through the glass door and stepped out into the cold morning air and kept walking. On the courthouse steps, Sandra caught up with her. That go the way you expected? More or less. Oh, Claire finished the last of her coffee and dropped the cup in a trash can at the bottom of the steps. Car's at the corner, Sandra said. You have the Westfield walkthrough at 11:30. Donovan called this morning. He wants to move the Pembroke closing to Thursday if you're available. Thursday works. Claire buttoned the top of her coat. Tell him to send the revised figures before Wednesday noon. Sandra made a note in her phone. You doing okay? I'm doing fine, Claire said, and she meant it the same way she'd meant it upstairs. Not as performance, not as armor, but as a simple and accurate statement of fact. She was fine. She had been building toward fine for a long time. They reached the corner of Garfield and 5th just as the car arrived. Not a taxi, not a rideshare. A black Mercedes S-Class limousine, long and silent, sliding to the curb with the kind of unhurried authority that belonged to vehicles and people who had no need to announce themselves. The driver stepped out, opened the rear door, and stood at attention. Claire glanced back toward the courthouse once, not because she needed to see Ethan again, but because she had the small, involuntary instinct to take a last look at a place you were leaving behind for good. Ethan was standing on the courthouse steps. He was staring at the limousine. His mouth was slightly open. Claire got in. The door closed behind her. The car pulled away from the curb with no drama, no acceleration, just the smooth and quiet motion of something that had somewhere to be. Inside, on the small mahogany console, there was a bottle of sparkling water, a folder of documents flagged with colored tabs, and a handwritten note from her office that read, Westfield confirmed 11:30. Pembroke docks on your tablet. Coffee in the thermos. Lena. Claire poured a glass of water, opened the first flagged document, and went back to work. Here is what Ethan Cross did not know about his ex-wife. He did not know about her grandmother. Eleanor Marsh had been a difficult woman by most accounts. Sharp-tongued and private, deeply suspicious of comfort, the kind of woman who kept her finances in a fireproof cabinet and her opinions largely to herself. She had raised Claire's mother alone after her husband left when Claire's mother was 4, had built a modest but durable income through 30 years of careful property purchases in the outer counties, and had died at the age of 81 with an estate that surprised almost everyone in the family and quietly astonished her granddaughter. Claire had been 26 when Eleanor died. She'd been with Ethan for 2 years already, engaged for 8 months, and when the estate attorney sat her down and walked her through the figures, her first thought had not been excitement or relief. It had been caution. The same caution her grandmother had exercised for decades. Eleanor had spoken about money the way most people don't, directly, without romance. She used to say that a fortune revealed too early becomes a target, and a target doesn't get to choose who aims at it. She'd said this to Claire specifically during the last year of her life when the cancer had made her both more frail and somehow more certain in everything she said. Don't show what you have until you know what you're dealing with, Eleanor told her once, sitting in the kitchen of the house on Mercer Lane with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't really drinking. Men especially. Not because they're worse than women, but because they're more likely to build their self-worth on top of yours and then call it love. Claire had been 24 that summer. She hadn't fully understood yet. By the time she was 30, sitting across from an estate attorney reviewing her grandmother's holdings, she understood it completely. She inherited $2.3 million in cash and liquidated assets, 6 residential properties across 3 counties, and controlling interest in a small property management company that Eleanor had run under the name Marsh Holdings, LLC. The company was quiet and unglamorous. It collected rents, maintained properties, handled the routine paperwork of ownership. But it was real. It had infrastructure. It had relationships with contractors and municipal offices and banks that had worked with Eleanor for years. Claire said nothing to Ethan about any of it. She told him her grandmother had left her some savings. A small amount. He hadn't asked for specifics, and she hadn't offered them. Instead, she hired a financial advisor named Raymond Chu, who specialized in estate growth and asset confidentiality, and she started working. She was, by training and profession, an accountant. A good one. She understood balance sheets and depreciation schedules and the way value moved through structures over time. She understood risk calibration and liquidity and the ways that patient money behaved differently than impatient money. She took everything her grandmother had built and began, methodically and without haste, to expand it. The first acquisition was a 12-unit apartment building in the Callaway district. Not a glamorous neighborhood, not a fashionable investment, but a solid one. The building was undervalued because it needed roof work and plumbing updates, and its previous owner had let 3 units go to vacancy rather than deal with the repairs. Claire bought it at below market, put in the necessary work, raised the building to full occupancy within 8 months, and refinanced at a higher value. She used the extracted equity to fund the next purchase. She did this again, and then again. The company she operated under, Meridian Property Group, existed on paper as the kind of quiet, competent business that doesn't attract attention. She was listed not as its primary owner, but as a managing consultant, the actual ownership routed through a trust structure that Raymond helped establish. When anyone at a dinner party asked what she did, Claire said she worked in financial consulting, which was true enough to not be a lie and detailed enough to stop most questions. Ethan never asked more than that. This was, she came to understand, the core of the problem. Not that he'd been deceitful, though he had been, but that he had never been particularly curious about her. He'd loved the idea of her capable, composed, someone who kept the financial side of their life organized so he didn't have to think about it. He appreciated her competence the way someone appreciates a reliable appliance. He didn't think about how it worked. He just expected it to. The affair with Vanessa had started, as best Claire could reconstruct, around the spring 3 years into the marriage. She didn't know the exact date. She'd first noticed something in the small ways. The new password on his phone, the way he came home from work slightly too relaxed, the particular quality of his distraction at dinner. She hadn't confronted him immediately. That was not how Claire operated. She watched. She documented. She consulted an attorney. What the investigation eventually revealed was more extensive than she'd expected, though somehow not more surprising. Ethan had been using their joint credit accounts to fund the relationship with Vanessa, dinners, weekends, a hotel stay in the Carver Bay Resort that Claire had been told was a work conference. He'd accumulated nearly $40,000 in shared debt tied to expenses she'd never seen the receipts for. He'd also taken out a personal loan she hadn't known about, using documentation that misrepresented their household income. When she sat with all of it, the printouts, the statements, the photographs from the investigator's report, she didn't feel rage. She felt something more like the cold clarity of a diagnosis. This was the condition. These were its symptoms. What remained was the treatment. She spent the next 6 months doing 3 things simultaneously. She continued going to work, coming home, making dinner on the nights it was her turn, attending the social engagements that were expected of them. She gave Ethan no indication that anything had changed. This was not as difficult as people might imagine. She had always been self-contained. He had never looked closely enough to notice the difference. She secured every asset. She worked with Raymond and her attorney to ensure that Meridian Property Group's ownership structure was airtight, properly documented, and entirely separate from any marital claim. She reviewed the prenuptial agreement she and Ethan had signed, the one he'd suggested early in the engagement, which had struck her at the time as practical and had struck her now as fortunate. The prenuptial protected separately held assets. What she'd built under Meridian was entirely separately held, and she continued building. She closed on 2 more properties during those 6 months, a commercial strip in the Ellsworth corridor and a 40-unit residential community in the Northgate neighborhood. Meridian's portfolio grew to 17 properties, generating consistent monthly income. By the time she finally placed the call to Sandra Yee and said she was ready to proceed, Meridian was worth, conservatively, somewhere in the range of $11 million in net asset value, with an income stream that her grandmother would have described simply as enough. The confrontation with Ethan had been nothing like what he'd probably expected from a confrontation. She'd waited for a Tuesday evening when he came home at the usual time, and they had no particular plans, and she'd set a folder on the kitchen table and told him she was filing for divorce. He'd stared at the folder without opening it. "What is this?" "Everything I have," she said. "You can look through it or not. Either way, I've already spoken to an attorney." He'd gone through the predictable stages rapidly. Confusion, then the attempt at indignation, then something that tried to be contrition but didn't quite reach it. He'd said things like, "You don't understand what's been going on with me lately, and this isn't what it looks like." And finally, when those didn't produce the reaction he was seeking, he'd landed on the one that revealed the most. "You're going to be fine," he said. And what he meant by it was, "You need me," and what he was really saying was, "You won't actually do this." "I know I'm going to be fine," Claire said. "That's not what I'm worried about." "Then what?" "I'm not worried about anything," she said. "This is just what's happening now." The divorce proceedings had taken 14 months. Ethan's attorney had attempted several angles that had all eventually failed. Claims against shared property that turned out not to be shared, challenges to asset disclosures that were meticulously documented, efforts to reframe the prenuptial terms that the agreement simply didn't support. Ethan had grown progressively more agitated as each approach dead-ended. He'd expected at some point that she would crack, that the financial pressure or the emotional weight or simple exhaustion would bring her back to the table with a different posture. She hadn't cracked. She'd shown up to every proceeding with her portfolio case and her paper coffee and her quiet, unhurried composure. And she'd signed the papers and walked out the door and gotten into a car that he hadn't known existed. And the look on his face when the limousine pulled away from the curb was something she hadn't planned for and didn't particularly need, but was, if she was being honest, not entirely unwelcome. She didn't hate him. She had somewhere along the way arrived at something closer to indifference, not the performed indifference of a person working hard not to feel something, but the genuine article. The feeling that occurs when you have fully accounted for a thing and there is no longer any unresolved charge to it. She'd loved him once. She was sure of that. At the beginning, in the first years, she had loved him the way people love what they believe they are seeing clearly. She'd believed she saw a man who was ambitious but not ruthless, charming but grounded, someone who valued what was real over what was impressive. She'd been wrong, or he'd changed, or some combination that didn't particularly matter anymore because the marriage was over and the morning was gray and cold, and the next flagged document in her portfolio folder was the contract for the Westfield property, which was the most significant acquisition she'd ever attempted. Sandra had called it aggressive. Raymond had called it calculated. Claire had called it the right move. Westfield was a 12-acre mixed-use development site on the eastern edge of the Callaway district, walking distance, as it happened, from the first building she'd ever bought. The land had been tied up in a municipality dispute for 3 years and had just cleared. The asking price was significant. The potential was larger. She'd been tracking it for 14 months through the entire divorce process, building the financing structure piece by piece on the side, waiting for the legal clearance to come through. It had come through 11 days ago. As the limousine moved through mid-morning traffic toward the property, Claire reviewed the Westfield file with the methodical attention she gave to everything that mattered. She marked 3 clauses she wanted Sandra to revisit. She noted 2 financing details she wanted to confirm with Raymond before the week was out. She drank her coffee from the thermos and made a note about the Pembroke timeline in the margin of a page. Outside the window, the city moved past. She watched it for a moment. The streets she'd walked on her lunch breaks for years. The buildings she'd looked at and thought about in terms of foundations and vacancy rates, and what a coat of paint and new fixtures actually did to a property's earning potential. The city she'd been quietly, methodically making herself a part of, one transaction at a time, while Ethan was at dinner with Vanessa at a restaurant he'd charged to a credit card they both owed. The driver turned onto Westfield Avenue, and the site came into view. 12 acres of cleared land with a chain-link fence and a sign that said, "Development pending" in orange letters. Claire closed the folder. She looked at it through the window for a long moment. She had work to do. The Westfield walkthrough took 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was longer than Claire had scheduled and exactly as long as it needed to be. The site manager, a heavy-set man named Carl Pruitt, who had been managing construction projects in Callaway for 22 years, walked her through the eastern perimeter first, pointing out where the drainage correction would need to happen before any foundation work could begin. He had the particular confidence of someone who understood the difference between what looked good on paper and what was actually true in the ground. And Claire appreciated that about him. She'd dealt with enough people in this business who told her what they thought she wanted to hear. "How far behind does the drainage push us?" she asked. Carl scratched the back of his neck. "If we get the remediation crew in by the first week of next month, we're looking at a 3-week delay off the original timeline. Maybe 4 if the ground is worse than the soil report shows. And if the soil report is accurate, then 3. But soil reports are like weather forecasts, right until they're not. Budget impact?" He gave her a number. She wrote it down without reacting to it. They walked the rest of the site in a wind that had picked up since morning, Carl talking about load-bearing requirements, and Claire asking the kinds of questions that told him she wasn't there to be impressed by technical vocabulary. She already had the vocabulary. She wanted the actual answers. By the time they reached the northwestern corner of the property, he had stopped explaining things the slow way and was just talking to her straight, which was what she'd been waiting for. When she got back into the car at 2:15, she called Raymond. "How's the Westfield?" he asked without preamble. "Drainage issue on the eastern edge. Adds 3 to 4 weeks, and approximately what I'm about to text you." A pause while she sent the number. "That's manageable," he said. "I know it's manageable. I want to know if it changes the financing structure." "It doesn't. The buffer we built in covers it with room." "Okay." She watched the fence line of the property pass through the rear window as the car pulled away. "I want to move on the Pembroke Close Thursday. Tell Donovan I'm available from 9. He'll be happy." "He doesn't need to be happy. He needs to be on time." Raymond laughed. He'd worked with Claire for nearly 8 years at this point, long enough to understand which parts of what she said were instruction and which parts were just the way she processed pressure out loud. "I'll tell him 9 o'clock, he said. "And Claire, how are you, after this morning?" She looked out the window. "I'm working," she said. "That's not what I asked." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm okay, Raymond. It was just a signature." She knew that wasn't entirely true, but it was true enough for a Tuesday, and the Pembroke file was on her tablet, and she still had 2 calls to return before 5 o'clock. What she didn't tell Raymond, what she hadn't told anyone really, was that the hardest part of the morning hadn't been the courtroom or the hallway or Ethan's particular brand of confident condescension. The hardest part had been the night before, alone in the apartment that still had his coffee mug on the shelf above the kitchen counter because she hadn't gotten around to moving it, sitting at her desk with the Westfield documents spread around her and the quiet of the place pressing in from all sides. She'd thought about at the beginning. She did that sometimes, still, despite herself. Thought about the person she'd believed Ethan was in those first years, and the particular grief of discovering that the person you built your life around was a partial invention. Not entirely. People were never entirely one thing, but enough of an invention that the real version couldn't hold the weight of what she'd thought they had. She'd sat at her desk for a while and let herself feel the weight of it, because that was the only way she knew to get through a thing, to let it be exactly as heavy as it actually was. Not heavier, not lighter. And then she'd gone back to the Westfield documents, because that was also true and also real, and was, in the morning, going to require her full attention. That was the night before. By the time the car reached downtown, she had 2 pages of notes on the Pembroke file and a response drafted for the email from the Municipal Planning Office about Meridian's permit application on the Northgate expansion. She was not unmoved. She was just not stopped. The story of how she had discovered the affair, was less dramatic than people probably imagined when they heard the word discovered. There had been no single devastating moment, no confrontation in a parking lot, no incriminating text message read over his shoulder. It had assembled itself the way most truths assemble, gradually, incrementally, in the accumulation of things that were slightly off. The first thing had been his phone. Ethan had always been casual about his phone, the way people are casual about things that hold no secrets, setting it face up on the coffee table, leaving it on the kitchen counter while he showered, answering calls on speaker in the car. And then, about 3.5 years into the marriage, the phone started going face down, started leaving the room with him, started requiring a new passcode that he'd set while she was out one Saturday, not mentioning it, which she wouldn't have noticed except that she'd tried to check the time on his phone while hers was charging and found she no longer could. She hadn't said anything. She'd noted it and continued watching. The second thing had been the receipts. They shared 2 credit accounts, and she managed both of them. Had from the beginning, because Ethan was disorganized about money in the impractical way of someone who earned well and spent without tracking, and she was an accountant who found financial disorder genuinely stressful. She reviewed both statements monthly. In the spring of the 3rd year, she began seeing line items she couldn't immediately account for. Restaurant charges on Tuesday evenings when Ethan had said he was working late. A hotel reservation in the Carver Bay area that he told her was a regional sales conference. Small but specific things that individually might have explanations and collectively did not. She cross-referenced the dates against his work calendar, which he kept on a shared system because she'd set it up that way years before, and he'd never bothered to change the access permissions. The Tuesday evenings didn't align with any work commitments. The Carver Bay dates corresponded to a long weekend in March when he'd told her he was attending a conference and had come home with a tan that he'd explained as the outdoor team-building portion of the program. She hadn't said anything then either. What she'd done was call a private investigator named Gerald Hatch, who operated out of a small office on the 4th floor of a building on Commerce Street and who came recommended by a woman in her professional network who had used him 2 years prior for a situation she didn't specify. Gerald was a small, careful man in his late 50s who spoke slowly and charged reasonably, and within 3 weeks had provided her with a report that was thorough enough to be conclusive. The day she received the report, she'd driven to a park near the Callaway district and sat in her car for an hour. Not crying. She'd done some of that in the following days, privately, in small, controlled amounts that she allowed herself because pretending not to feel it wasn't actually an option. But that afternoon in the car had been mostly the experience of the floor shifting beneath something you thought was stable. The reconfiguration of everything you'd understood to be true about your current life. She'd sat there and let the report be real, and at some point she'd started her car and driven to the Callaway property, the first building she'd ever bought, and parked in front of it and looked at it for a while. The building had needed a roof and new plumbing, and the kind of attention that was primarily unglamorous and primarily worth it. She'd put in the work, and it had become something solid. That was the thing about real property. It didn't pretend to be what it wasn't. It either held or it didn't. The work either mattered or it didn't. There was no ambiguity in the structure of a building the way there turned out to be ambiguity in the structure of a marriage. She'd driven home and made dinner and not said a word. The months that followed were, professionally speaking, among her most productive. She closed on the Ellsworth commercial strip in July, the Northgate community in October, refinanced the Callaway building in September at a valuation that made Raymond quietly enthusiastic in his restrained way. She hired a second property manager to handle the growing portfolio and brought in a junior associate at Meridian to manage the administrative load. She did all of this in the margins of a life that looked from the outside unchanged. Ethan noticed nothing. This was not surprising. He was occupied with the maintenance of a double life, which is a consuming and self-referential business. And his attention had been diverted from her in the incremental way that diverted attention operates. By degrees, so gradually that neither person marks the precise moment when one person stops seeing the other clearly. He still came home to dinner. They still went to the events they'd committed to as a couple. She still asked him about his day, and he still gave her the kind of answer that was neither a lie nor anything real. She wondered sometimes, in the way she wondered about things that didn't have clean answers, whether any part of him knew she was pulling further and further away on her own terms, parallel to his own departure, each of them vacating the marriage from their separate directions without the honesty of naming it. She didn't think so. Ethan had never been a man who looked beneath surfaces he found comfortable. It was his attorney who first introduced her to the phrase dissipation of marital assets, which was the legal term for what Ethan had done with the joint accounts. The $40,000 in documented expenses tied to the relationship with Vanessa, the personal loan taken against falsified income figures, a credit line he'd opened in both their names that she'd been unaware of until the discovery process surfaced it. The prenuptial agreement had already protected everything she'd built under Meridian, but the dissipation claims were an additional matter, one that Sandra had pursued with the careful, methodical energy she brought to things she found genuinely objectionable. "He really thought you didn't know," Sandra told her once, during a working session in her office 3 months into the proceedings. His attorney basically telegraphed that in every exchange. He thinks he's negotiating with someone who's emotionally compromised. "I know," Claire said. "It's an interesting strategy." Sandra's tone was dry. "Given the documentation we have." "He's always underestimated paperwork," Claire said. Sandra had smiled at that, a small, genuine one. "Well," she said, "we have excellent paperwork." They did. The 14 months of proceedings had required patience of a specific kind, the kind that isn't passive, that does its work quietly while appearing to wait. She'd sat through 4 mediation sessions and 2 full court hearings, and a deposition that Ethan's attorney had structured as an attempt to fluster her, asking questions about her finances in the tone people use when they expect confusion, not realizing they were asking a licensed CPA to explain her own balance sheets. She'd answered every question accurately and completely, and had watched the deposition proceed with the unhurried confidence of someone who had nothing to hide, and more importantly, had organized everything they had into impenetrable clarity. The final settlement had been neither a victory nor a defeat in the theatrical sense. It was a legal document. Ethan retained his car, his retirement accounts, and the mutual debts he'd accumulated that were traceable to his own conduct. He lost the house. They'd agreed to sell it and split the equity, which was modest given the mortgage they still carried, and was assigned full liability for the fraudulent credit line and a portion of the dissipation claims. He didn't lose everything that morning in the courthouse, but he left with considerably less than he'd arrived with, and what he'd done to arrive at that outcome was entirely his own. Claire had walked out with what she'd built. All of it, intact, documented, and moving forward. Lena Park had worked for Meridian Property Group for 3 years, originally as an administrative coordinator, and now, increasingly, as something that functioned more like an operations manager without the formal title, which Claire had been meaning to address and had added to the agenda for their standing Thursday meeting. Lena was 29, efficient in a way that was systemic rather than frantic, and had the useful quality of communicating problems clearly without dramatizing them. She was waiting at the Meridian office on the 11th floor of the Greystone building when Claire arrived at 4 o'clock that Tuesday afternoon, coffee already made, the week's action items on the whiteboard in her clean, precise handwriting. "Pembroke's confirmed for Thursday at 9, Lena said, handing Claire a stack of messages. "The municipal office called about the Northgate permit. They want revised drainage documentation by end of month. We were going to need to update that anyway after Westfield. Have Carl's office send the revised report when it's ready, and we'll incorporate it." Claire set her bag on the desk and turned to the whiteboard. "What's the Hargrove situation?" "Still unresolved." Lena's expression shifted slightly, the way it did when she was about to say something she knew Claire wasn't going to enjoy. "Their maintenance contractor filed a mechanics lien this morning." Claire was quiet for a moment. The Hargrove building, a 16-unit property in the Millfield neighborhood, had been a problematic acquisition from the start, bought at a discount because of its complication, and proving to be worth every cent of that discount in the months since. The previous owner had a tangle of outstanding contractor obligations that hadn't fully surfaced in the original title search, and the mechanics lien was the 3rd issue in 8 months. "Get me Gerald Poe's office on the phone tomorrow morning," she said. Gerald Poe was the real estate litigator they used for exactly this category of problem. "And pull everything we have on the contractor relationship going back to the original purchase." "Already started," Lena said. "And one more thing," she paused. "There's a message from a man named Adrian Brooks. He says you met at the Hartwell conference 2 months ago, and he's been meaning to follow up. Claire looked up from the whiteboard. She did remember Adrian Brooks. He'd sat across from her during a panel discussion on urban development funding and had asked a question about affordable housing finance structures that showed he actually understood what he was asking about, which was rarer than it should have been at events like that. They'd spoken briefly after the panel. He was the founder and managing partner of Brooks Development Group, one of the larger development firms operating in the region. She'd looked up his firm afterward out of professional curiosity. It was serious. His projects were the kind that got written about for the right reasons. What did the message say? She asked. Lena handed her a pink message slip. She still used them, a habit Claire had teased her about, and had stopped teasing her about when she realized Lena's paper messages never got lost the way digital ones did. The note said, Adrian Brooks, Brooks Development Group, hoping to connect when you have time, exploring some collaboration ideas, not urgent, whenever works for you. Claire read it twice. She set it on the desk. Send him my assistant's calendar link, she said. Tell him I have availability next week. Will do. Lena made the note. Anything else before end of day? No. Claire turned back to the whiteboard and picked up a marker. Yes. One thing. Can you order something for dinner? Whatever the Thai place on Elmore has for delivery. I'm going to be here for a while. Lena smiled. The usual, Claire said and turned back to the board. The evening stretched out around her, the city going amber and then dark outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Meridian office, the whiteboard filling with notes and numbers and the mapped logic of what came next. She ate at her desk while reviewing the Pembroke documents, made 3 calls, sent 6 emails, and revised her notes on the Westfield drainage issue twice before she was satisfied. It was past 9 when she finally put her coat on and turned off the office lights. In the elevator down, she looked at her reflection in the brushed steel doors, the charcoal coat she'd worn to the courthouse that morning. Her face, which looked like what it was, a face that had been through something and had not dissolved. She was 41 years old. She had a portfolio of 23 properties generating stable monthly income, a development project that was the largest of her career, and a dinner tab from a Thai place that she still needed to expense. She had a mechanic's lien on the Hargrove building that was going to require a litigator and likely a long Tuesday the following month. She had, tucked on the left-hand corner of her desk under the edge of her laptop, a pink message slip from a man named Adrian Brooks, who had asked a smart question at a conference 2 months ago. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. She walked out into the cold night and flagged a cab because the car service was for mornings, and she wasn't precious about it, and sometimes a cab was just a cab. She gave the driver her address and sat back and looked out the window at the city passing by. Her city, in all the ways that a city can belong to a person who has put real work into it, which is the only way it ever actually does. The message from Adrian Brooks had sat on the left corner of her desk for 4 days before she did anything about it. This wasn't avoidance. She had the Pembroke closing on Thursday, which went long because Donovan's title company had flagged a boundary discrepancy that required 2 hours of phone calls and a revised survey before anyone was comfortable signing anything. She had the Hargrove Mechanics lien, which Gerald Poe's office was handling, but which required her to review and approve a 14-page response document before it went out. She had the Northgate permit revision, the Westfield drainage timeline, a staff meeting on Wednesday that ran 40 minutes over schedule because her property manager Marcus had discovered a heating system issue at the Callaway building that had turned out to be less serious than initially reported, but had consumed the better part of a morning to confirm. She also had, tucked into the ordinary texture of a working week, the residual weight of a marriage that had just legally concluded, not grief exactly, more like the low-grade disorientation of a routine that no longer applied. She'd catch herself doing small things out of habit, and then remembering they were habits built for a different version of her life. She'd bought 2 cups of coffee at the corner cart on Wednesday morning before realizing she had no one to bring the second one home to, and had stood on the sidewalk for a moment holding both cups like an idiot before giving the extra one to a woman at the bus stop who looked like she needed it. She called Adrian Brooks on Friday morning from her office at 8:15 before Lena arrived. He picked up on the second ring. Brooks. This is Claire Bennett, she said, from Meridian Property Group. You left a message earlier this week. Claire, his voice shifted into something more present. I was starting to think you were letting me down easy. I had a busy week. Fair enough. A brief pause, the kind that suggested he was genuinely thinking rather than performing. I appreciate you calling. I'll get to it directly. I've been looking at your work on the Northgate community and the Callaway district, and I think there might be some meaningful overlap with what Brooks Development is trying to do on the Eastern Corridor. I wanted to have a conversation, no agenda attached, just a conversation. Claire turned her chair toward the window. The morning was clearer than it had been all week, the kind of sharp cold that made the city look clean from a distance. What kind of overlap are you thinking about? Affordable housing with real infrastructure behind it, he said. Not the kind where a developer hits the mandated percentage and calls it a day. The kind where you actually think about who's living there and what they need around them. He stopped. You've been doing that for years without a lot of noise about it. I find that interesting. She found it interesting that he'd done enough research to know that. Where on the Eastern Corridor? She asked. I'd rather show you than describe it. Could you do lunch next week? She looked at her calendar. Wednesday, she said. 1 o'clock. Wednesday at 1 works. I'll send you the address. She set the phone down and looked out the window for another moment. Then she opened her email and went back to work. Ethan Cross had spent the week after the divorce doing what Ethan Cross did when he was uncomfortable, which was project an air of someone who was not uncomfortable at all. He and Vanessa had gone to dinner at a restaurant in the Fenwick district on the Friday after the courthouse, a place where the booths were low lit and the menu had no prices on the version they gave to one person at the table. He'd ordered expensive and smiled at Vanessa across the table and talked about the projects at work and what he wanted to do with the apartment now that it was just theirs. And Vanessa had smiled back and they'd had a good evening. From the outside, it looked like two people who had gotten exactly what they wanted. From the inside, if you'd been paying closer attention than Vanessa was paying, you might have noticed that Ethan checked his phone 3 times during dinner. And not because anyone had messaged him. He'd expected something. Not a call. He wasn't naive enough to expect a call. But something. Some indication from the direction of Claire's life that the decision had registered as a loss. He'd driven by the apartment building where she'd lived during the separation once, not slowly, just a regular pass on the way somewhere he could have reached by a slightly different route, and the building had looked the way it always looked and told him nothing. He'd asked his attorney, carefully, and without admitting why he was asking, whether Claire had filed anything additional since the finalization. His attorney had said no, and asked why, and Ethan had said no reason, just making sure, and moved on. What he hadn't expected was how the next several weeks would feel. The divorce proceedings had organized his discomfort into a specific shape. There was always something to respond to, a document to review, a position to take, an attorney to call. Without that structure, the discomfort was formless, which was harder to manage. He told himself for a year and a half that once it was over, he'd feel lighter. He didn't feel lighter. He felt like a man who'd been running for a long time and had stopped and didn't know quite what he was supposed to do with his hands. Vanessa, for her part, was 3 weeks into what she'd called a natural adjustment period, which he understood to mean she was waiting for him to be easier to be around. She was patient about it, more patient than he'd expected, which made him vaguely grateful and vaguely guilty in ways he couldn't fully articulate. "You're somewhere else," she said one evening, not accusingly, just as a statement of fact. They were on the couch, and she'd muted the television, which was the signal she used when she wanted to actually talk. "I'm here," he said. "You've been checking your phone all night." He set the phone face down on the coffee table. "I'm not waiting for anything." Vanessa looked at him with the particular patience of someone who knows the difference between what a person says and what they mean. She was 31 and perceptive in the directed way of people who have spent their careers learning how to read rooms quickly. "It's been 6 weeks," she said. "You haven't heard from her. You're probably not going to hear from her." He opened his mouth to say something about how that wasn't what this was, and then didn't say it because it was at least partially what this was, and Vanessa would know that, and he was tired of saying things to a woman who could see through them. "She got into a car," he said, "after the courthouse." Vanessa waited. "A limousine," he said. "A real one, not a car service. A Mercedes. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. You never mentioned that. I didn't think about it much until later. He picked up his phone again and set it down again. It's probably nothing. Somebody sent a car. Who? I don't know. Vanessa turned back toward the television. After a moment, she unmuted it. They sat in the kind of silence that has things in it. Ethan didn't tell her that he'd looked up Meridian Property Group. He'd found the website, Professional and Spare, with a small About section that listed Claire Bennett as managing principal. He'd looked at the portfolio page and found it listed 21 properties across 4 districts. He'd looked at a brief mention in a regional business newsletter from 7 months ago that described Meridian as a quietly expanding force in the Callaway District's residential development market. He'd stared at that sentence for longer than he intended to. He wasn't sure what he'd expected Claire's professional life to look like. He'd known she did financial consulting of some kind, had never really probed into what exactly, had considered it, and this was the part he found difficult to look at directly, as a background thing. The kind of work that paid well enough but didn't require serious attention from him. She'd managed their household finances with the thoroughness that came naturally to her, and he'd let her do it and had understood that as a kind of division of competencies rather than as evidence of a specific and serious skill. 21 properties. Managing principal. A limousine at the courthouse curb. He closed the browser window and made himself stop. It's it. The Hargrove situation resolved imperfectly in the 3rd week of the month. Gerald Poe's office had filed the response to the mechanic's lien with enough documented evidence of the previous owner's obligations to make the contractor's claim legally tenuous. And after 2 rounds of negotiation, the contractor had agreed to a reduced settlement that came out of the escrow holdback rather than Meridian's operating budget. It was still money going out the door that shouldn't have needed to go out the door. And it left Claire with a residual irritation about the original title search that she'd expressed once to Sandra, who had expressed it in turn to the title company, and then she'd let it go because there was no productive place for it to go. She'd learned that about problems, that there was a point at which the analysis of what went wrong became a way of not moving forward, and she didn't have the patience for that. You fixed what could be fixed, you noted what needed to be done differently, and you went back to the work. Wednesday at 1 o'clock, she walked into a restaurant called Brenly's on the corner of 4th and Merchant, a place she'd been to twice before for client lunches, and found Adrian Brooks already seated. He stood when she approached. He was taller than she remembered. She'd only seen him seated at the conference, somewhere around 6'2", with the kind of face that had lived in it, lines around the eyes, jaw slightly broader than conventionally handsome, dressed in a navy jacket and an open-collar shirt in a way that suggested money comfortable enough not to need to announce itself. He extended his hand. "Claire, thank you for making the time." "You're already here," she said, sitting across from him. "I'm not even late." "Force of habit," he said, sitting back down. "I'm always early and I'm always slightly embarrassed about it." She found that unexpectedly human. "I'm always exactly on time," she said, "which probably says the same thing about me." He smiled at that, and she noted that it reached his eyes without any effort, which was either genuine or very well practiced, and she'd decide later which. They ordered. She got the roasted chicken because she was hungry, and it was what she wanted, not the salad, and he got a bowl of soup that he'd clearly ordered before and knew was good. And they talked about the Eastern Corridor. Adrian's project was a 12-block stretch of underutilized land on the city's eastern boundary, a neighborhood called Fenmore that had been economically depressed for 2 decades following the closure of a manufacturing plant that had once employed a significant portion of its residents. He'd been in conversation with the municipal planning office for 18 months about a phased development proposal that would bring mixed-income residential, a community health clinic, and a commercial strip designed to draw local ownership rather than chains. "The financing structure is workable," he said, "but the affordable component is where we've been losing time. We can hit the required percentages, but if we're being honest about it, hitting a percentage and actually building something that works for the people who live there are very different propositions." "They are," Claire said. "I've been watching what you did at Northgate, the income screening, the maintenance standards, the community room arrangement with the credit union." He paused. "That wasn't a developer filling a box. That was somebody who thought about it." She looked at him. How did you know about the credit union arrangement? I talked to the branch manager, he said simply. She speaks very highly of you. That was thorough. She didn't say so, but she noted it. What are you looking for from Meridian? She asked. Consultation at minimum, potentially co-development on the residential component. He leaned forward slightly. I have the capital and the project relationships. What I don't have is someone who has actually lived inside the problem the way you have. I build large. You build right. I think there's something in the combination. It was a direct pitch. She appreciated the directness. She also knew better than to respond to a pitch in the meeting where the pitch happened. Send me the project documentation, she said. The planning office correspondence, the financial model, the community engagement notes if you have them. I'll look at it and we can talk again. Fair, he said. I'll tell you one thing now, she added. If we talk again and I have questions, I'll ask them directly and I'll expect direct answers. I don't have the patience for people who manage information. He looked at her steadily. Neither do I, he said, which is why I called you and not someone else. She wasn't sure she entirely believed that, the way you're never sure about anyone the first time, but she found herself thinking on the cab ride back to the Greystone building that she wanted to look at the documentation, which was a response she hadn't entirely expected. But 3 weeks after that lunch, the Westfield project hit its first serious obstacle. The drainage remediation had gone according to Carl's 3-week estimate, which meant they were back on schedule by early November. But when the foundation survey crew went in, they encountered something the soil report hadn't reflected. A section of the northeastern quadrant where the ground composition changed in a way that required a structural engineering review before foundation work could proceed. The engineer, a meticulous woman named Dr. Sylvia Kwan, who arrived on site in steel-toed boots and did not smile until she had something specific to smile about, spent 2 days on the property before delivering her assessment. You've got a soil layer transition about 8 feet down in the northeastern corner, she told Claire, standing at the edge of the site with a wind that was doing its best to end the conversation early. It's not insurmountable, but your foundation design needs to account for it. You're looking at a modified deep pour on that quadrant. What does that do to the timeline? 6 weeks, roughly. Claire was quiet. And the cost? She asked. Dr. Kwan gave her a number. It was not a small number. Claire stood at the edge of the site and looked at the 12 acres of cleared land and felt the weight of the thing settle into a shape she could hold. 6 weeks and a significant cost overrun on a project that was already her largest, and on a month when she'd also absorbed the Hargrove settlement and had the Northgate permit revision still pending. The numbers were not comfortable. She called Raymond from her car outside the site. I heard from Carl, Raymond said when he picked up. He'd already been briefed. Tell me about the financing buffer. It covers about 60% of the overrun. The rest requires a draw from the operating reserve or a bridge arrangement. Operating reserve, she said without hesitation. I don't want a bridge loan on Westfield, not at this stage. That takes the reserve down to a level I want to note for the record. Noted, she said. It's still above the floor we set. Barely. Raymond. She looked out the windshield at the fence line of the Westfield site. Is it workable? A pause. She could hear him checking something. It's workable, he said. It's uncomfortable, but it's workable. Then we do it. She started the car. Get the modified engineering specs to Carl's office today. I want the schedule revised by Friday. She drove back toward the city and thought about what her grandmother would have said about a soil layer transition 8 feet down in the northeastern quadrant of a 12-acre site. Eleanor Marsh would have said something dry and precise about the ground not carrying what you'd planned for it, and then she would have said to fix it and move on. She was moving on. Ethan called his friend Derek Paulson for the first time since the divorce had been finalized, on a Thursday evening in November, in the way that men sometimes call old friends when they need to talk about something they don't intend to name. Derek was one of those friendships built on convenience and duration rather than particular depth. They'd worked at the same company for 3 years in their early 30s, played in the same recreational basketball league, known each other long enough to skip certain formalities without having the kind of intimacy that requires honesty. Derek had been at the wedding. He'd also, Claire had always privately suspected, known about Vanessa before Claire did. They met at a bar on Crestwood Avenue that they'd been to dozens of times. The kind of place with good beer on draft and televisions showing sports. Nobody in the room was urgently watching. "You doing okay?" Derek asked, in the tone of someone who expects a particular answer. "I'm fine," Ethan said. "I'm good." "Good." Derek nodded. They watched the television for a moment. "Vanessa good?" "Yeah." A pause. "She's good." Derek nodded again. He took a drink of his beer. "You know, I looked up Claire," he said. Not apologetically, just as a statement. Ethan turned to look at him. "After the courthouse," Derek said. "Word got around about the car. Some people from the company were there for something else, apparently. People talk." He set his glass down. "Meridian Property Group. I looked it up." Ethan said nothing. 20-something properties, Derek said. There was an article in the Callaway Business Review from last spring, called her one of the district's most influential developers. The bar noise continued around them. A cheer went up from the far end over something on one of the televisions. "I didn't know," Ethan said. "I know you didn't." "I mean, I really didn't know." He said it again because the first time hadn't conveyed the actual weight of it. "We were married for 6 years. I asked her about work, and she said financial consulting, and I didn't ask more than that." Derek picked up his glass and looked at it. "Why not?" It was a simple question that didn't have a simple answer, and Ethan sat with it for longer than was comfortable. "I guess I thought I already knew what it was," he said finally. Derek didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. Ethan drove home that night thinking about the 6 years in a way he'd been avoiding since the courthouse. Not the affair. He'd done his accounting on that, in the selective way people do accounting on their own misconduct. He thought instead about all the Tuesday evenings and work dinners and Saturday mornings where Claire had been at her desk working on something and he'd walked past and assumed it was what it had always appeared to be and moved on with his day. He'd believed he knew her. He'd believed this genuinely, not as a performance. He'd told people, when anyone asked how his wife was doing, that she was good, she was solid, she managed all the financial stuff. Claire's always got it handled. He'd said it as a compliment. He hadn't understood that he was describing the surface of something he'd never looked beneath. He didn't know what he expected to feel about that. Shame, maybe. He felt something adjacent to it, not quite clean enough to be the real thing. When he got home, Vanessa was already asleep. He stood in the kitchen for a while in the dark without turning on the lights, and then he went to his desk and opened his laptop and looked at the Meridian website again. He read the portfolio page, the 23 properties it listed now. It had grown in the weeks since he'd first looked. And he looked at the project description for something called Westfield, described as a major mixed-use development in the Callaway district. He sat there for a while with the screen light on his face, doing the math he should have done a long time ago about what he'd had and what he'd not paid attention to. In the other room, Vanessa's phone lit up on the nightstand. He could see the glow from where he was sitting. A notification from someone. Late for a notification. He looked at it. He looked away. He looked back. He did not get up to check. He just sat there in the dark with his laptop and the quiet of an apartment he'd wanted and the slow, arriving weight of consequences that are never as dramatic as you imagine them while they're forming, but land exactly as hard when they finally do. The documentation Adrian sent arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a folder that contained 47 pages of planning correspondence, a financial model with 3 scenario projections, and a community engagement summary compiled from 6 neighborhood meetings conducted over a period of 8 months in the Fenmore district. Claire read all of it over the weekend. Not quickly. She read it the way she read everything that mattered, with a pencil and a notepad beside her, marking pages, writing questions, building a picture of what was real versus what was optimistic. She sat at the desk in her apartment on Saturday morning with coffee going cold beside her and worked through the financial model first, because the model was where you found out whether someone actually understood their own project, or whether they'd hired someone to make the numbers look coherent without knowing what the numbers meant. Adrian's model was honest in a way that financial models frequently weren't. The scenario projections included a realistic downside that showed genuine stress on the project if construction costs ran over 15%, or if lease-up on the commercial component took longer than projected. Most developers presented two scenarios, an optimistic one and a slightly less optimistic one. The downside scenario in Adrian's model was actually a downside, and it didn't pretend the project sailed through it without consequence. She respected that. It was the kind of honesty that either came from experience or from the kind of temperament that didn't need to oversell things, and possibly both. The community engagement notes were the part she hadn't expected to spend as long on as she did. 6 neighborhood meetings over 8 months, with attendance logs and notes from each session. Real names of real residents who had shown up to talk about what they needed, what they feared, what the neighborhood had looked like before the plant closed, and what they wanted it to look like in 20 years. One section quoted a woman named Darlene, who had lived on Fenmore's Crestwood block for 38 years, and had attended 4 of the 6 meetings, and had told the planning team, at the 3rd meeting, that she wasn't opposed to development. She was opposed to development that treated existing residents as a temporary inconvenience. The note read, "Darlene asked us to promise that the people already here would still be able to afford to be here after we finished. We told her we didn't make promises we couldn't keep, but we were trying to build something that would earn that promise." She said, "Then you better be serious about the trying." Claire had read that twice. She called Adrian on Sunday morning. He picked up on the 3rd ring, slightly out of breath. "Brooks." "It's Claire Bennett. Am I interrupting something?" "I was moving boxes," he said. "Renovation in the home office. It's fine. Hold on." A brief pause, the sound of something being set down. "You read the documentation?" "I did." "And?" She looked at the notepad she'd filled over the weekend. "I have 14 questions." A short silence. 14 specific questions or 14 categories of concern? "Both," she said. Some of the specific questions contained categories. He laughed. A real one, not a polished one. "Okay, when do you want to go through them?" "Tuesday," she said. "My office, 2 o'clock. Bring whoever built the financial model." "That would be me," he said. She noted that without comment. "Then just you. 2 o'clock Tuesday." The Tuesday meeting ran 3 hours and 10 minutes, which was longer than she'd scheduled and exactly as long as it needed to be. She asked her 14 questions in sequence, and Adrian answered them without deflecting and without over-explaining. And on 3 of them he said directly that he didn't have a complete answer yet, and here was what he was still working through, which was more useful to her than a confident answer that papered over an unresolved problem. On the question of the commercial component lease-up timeline, they disagreed. She thought his projection was 6 months too optimistic for a neighborhood with Fenmore's current foot traffic patterns, and he pushed back, not defensively, but with specific data points that made her revise her position slightly while holding her general concern. It was the kind of disagreement that made the thing better, which was the only kind worth having. By the end of the 3rd hour, they had the rough shape of a co-development structure on the Fenmore residential component, subject to documentation, subject to board review on his side, and Raymond's analysis on hers, subject to a half-dozen things that needed to happen before anyone signed anything. But the shape was there. Lena brought in coffee at some point without being asked, set it on the edge of the desk, and left without a word. Claire had not asked for it, and had not acknowledged it, and drank it without thinking about it, which Lena understood was the correct outcome. After Adrian left, she stood at the window for a while looking at the city. She felt the particular aliveness of a meeting where something real had happened, not the manufactured energy of a deal for its own sake, but the specific interest of work that was pointed at something she actually cared about. She hadn't expected to feel that in a meeting with Adrian Brooks. She'd expected competence and ambition, and the particular confidence of someone who had been successful long enough to stop being surprised by it. She'd found those things. She'd also found someone who had read Darlene's comment in the community engagement notes and had underlined it. She'd noticed the underlining when she'd gone through his copy of the document during the meeting. She hadn't mentioned it, but she'd noticed. The Westfield modified foundation pour happened in the 2nd week of December, running over 4 days in temperatures that made the work miserable for Carl's crew and introduced 2 additional minor complications that Carl reported to her with the stoic brevity of a man who had encountered weather before and intended to encounter it again. Claire visited the site twice during the pour, not to supervise. Carl didn't need supervision, and she understood the difference between oversight and interference. But because Westfield was hers in a way that the other properties in the portfolio weren't quite, and she wanted to be present in it. The second visit was on a Thursday afternoon when the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees and the sky was a uniform flat gray, and the construction crew was working in layers of Carhartt and thermal underlayers, and nobody was happy about it. She walked the perimeter with Carl, who was wearing a wool hat pulled over his ears and had the expression of a man who had made his professional peace with discomfort decades ago. "How's it holding?" she asked. "Modified pour looks good," he said. "Compression readings are where we want them. We'll know more after the cure, but right now, I'm not worried." "How's the crew holding up?" He glanced at her. It wasn't the question he usually got from property owners. "They're cold," he said, "but they're working. Is there anything they need?" He thought about it for a moment. "Hot food wouldn't go unappreciated," he said. "It's a long shift." She made a call from her car before she left the site. 3 days later, she arranged for lunch delivery from a restaurant downtown, not sandwiches, actual hot meals, which Lena coordinated for the remaining days of the pour. Carl sent her a text that said simply, "Crew says thanks. Good people remember the people doing the work." She read it twice, and then put her phone in her bag and went back to the Pembroke follow-up she'd been working on. She was not particularly sentimental about it. She just thought it was the right thing to do, and she'd stopped waiting for a complicated reason to do right things. Ethan Cross's year collapsed in stages, the way collapses usually happen. Not in one dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of smaller failures that each look survivable until they don't. The first stage was professional. His company, a regional sales firm called Hartfield Commercial Partners, had been under financial pressure for most of the past year, and in January, 2 months after the divorce was finalized, the regional restructuring he'd been assured wouldn't affect his division affected his division. He wasn't let go, but his territory was reduced, his commission structure was revised in a way that dropped his effective income by roughly 22%, and 3 of his best accounts were redistributed to a national team that the company had quietly decided was the future of their model. He sat in his manager's office while this was explained to him with the specific language of corporate restructuring that means something real is being said underneath the language. And he nodded and said he understood and went back to his desk and spent the afternoon making calls to accounts he was no longer responsible for, out of habit. He didn't tell Vanessa immediately. He told her 2 weeks later when she noticed he'd stopped talking about work the way he usually did, and she asked, and he told her. She was measured about it in the way that people are measured when they're recalculating something they haven't said out loud yet. The second stage was financial. The settlement from the divorce had assigned him the full liability on the credit line he'd opened in both their names, which amounted to approximately $31,000, and the dissipation claim settlement had added another 12. He was carrying these on top of his existing personal loan, which had a rate that had seemed manageable at the income level he'd been at when he took it out. With the revised commission structure, the monthly obligations had a different relationship to his income than they'd had 6 months ago, and that relationship was uncomfortable. He'd always been bad at money in the way that people who earn well can afford to be bad. Imprecise, optimistic, oriented toward what he wanted rather than what the numbers actually said. Claire had managed the household finances, and he'd let her, and he'd never fully understood how much of what he'd assumed was natural ease had been her work keeping the machinery functional. Without that, he was confronting his own financial habits directly for the first time in 6 years, and what he found was not encouraging. He cut things. He didn't go back to the Fenwick District restaurant. He quietly canceled 2 subscriptions he'd barely used and a club membership he'd renewed out of inertia. He moved more of his eating to the kitchen, which Vanessa navigated without complaint, though she cooked less enthusiastically than he'd expected, and more frequently suggested they get delivery, which was not nothing. The third stage was Vanessa herself, and this was the one he'd told himself the least stories about, which made it the one that surprised him most. It didn't end with a confrontation. That was the thing. There was no scene, no discovery of a second betrayal, no inciting incident he could point to as the moment. It ended the way long-pressure situations end when both people have silently decided before either of them has said so, gradually and then all at once. She told him in March, in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening, that she thought they were better as what they'd been before all of this, which was a way of saying what they'd been was not what either of them had pretended it was, which was a way of saying she was leaving without quite saying she was leaving, but she was leaving. He hadn't argued. He'd sat at the kitchen table after she went to pack some things and looked at the surface of it for a while. When Derek called that weekend to check in, the way Derek had been checking in occasionally since November, a version of friendship that was better than nothing, Ethan told him Vanessa had left. Derek said he was sorry. "Are you?" Ethan asked. A pause. "I'm sorry you're having a bad year," Derek said. "That's true." Ethan made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. "I looked up Meridian again," he said. "They're doing some major project on the Eastern Corridor with Adrian Brooks. You know who that is?" "Vaguely. Big developer. She's co-developing with him. There was a piece about it in the Regional Business Journal last month." Derek was quiet for a moment. "Ethan," he said, not unkindly, "stop looking her up." "I know." "I mean it. It's not good for you." "I know," Ethan said again. And he did know. It was the gap between knowing and stopping that he hadn't figured out how to close. The Fenmore project agreement was signed in February, 4 months after the first lunch at Brenly's. Raymond had spent 6 weeks on the financial structure and had come back with 3 revisions and 1 significant concern about the distribution arrangement on the commercial component, which Claire had taken back to Adrian, who had agreed to the revision with the directness that she'd come to expect from him. Sandra had spent 2 additional weeks on the legal documentation and had flagged 1 clause that required renegotiation, which had taken another 10 days. It was not a fast process. It was a thorough one, which was the only kind Claire trusted. The signing happened in the Brooks Development Group conference room on a Tuesday morning, which was a different kind of Tuesday than the one 14 months ago in courtroom 6. Sandra was there, and Raymond by phone, and Adrian's legal team, and Lena, who had brought a folder of post-signing action items that Claire would need before the day was out. After the signatures, Adrian's assistant brought out a bottle of sparkling water and a bottle of champagne, and Adrian poured the champagne and handed Claire a glass, and she held it without drinking it immediately, looking at the document on the table. "You're not celebrating yet," he said. "I celebrate when there's something finished," she said. "Right now there's just something started." "Fair," he said. He drank his champagne. She drank hers. It was good champagne, not that she'd have said so out loud. After Sandra and Raymond's call had ended, and the Brooks legal team had filed out, she and Adrian stood at the conference room window looking out at the Eastern Corridor. You could see the edge of the Fenmore district from this building if you knew which direction to look. A stretch of rooftops and streets that currently looked like what they were and would, over the next 3 years, become something else. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask," she said. "What made you say yes? I've pitched collaboration structures to a lot of people with more capital than you and gotten a faster yes. You took 4 months." She considered the question honestly. "Because a fast yes would have meant I wasn't paying attention," she said. "And I needed to know whether the project was real or whether it was a version of real that looks good until you're 3 years in." And your financial model had a real downside scenario," she said. "And you underlined Darlene's comment." He looked at her. "You noticed that?" "I notice most things," she said. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone deciding something. "I've been in this business for 19 years, he said. "I've worked with a lot of smart people. What you do is different. You don't just understand the numbers. You understand what the numbers are supposed to be doing." "That's what the numbers are for," she said. "Most people forget that." She turned away from the window. "Send me the Fenmore Community Liaison contacts. I want to reach out to the Neighborhood Association before the public announcement goes out. They should hear about the partnership directly, not through a press release. I'll have them to you by end of day." He paused. "Dinner sometime?" "Not a meeting, just dinner." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back without pressing it, which was the right thing to do. "Send me the community contacts first," she said. He smiled. "End of day," he said. She called her mother that evening from the apartment, which she did less often than she intended to and more often than she gave herself credit for. Her mother, Ruth Bennett, lived in a small house in the Riverside district where Claire had grown up, and had the quality of people who have lived long enough to stop being surprised by most things, which made her either very good or very difficult to talk to depending on what you needed. "How's the work?" Ruth asked. She always asked about the work first, which Claire had once found impersonal and now understood as a form of respect. "Signed a major partnership today," Claire said. "Eastern Corridor Development. It's going to be a few years of heavy lifting." "Good heavy or bad heavy?" "Good, I think." She sat down on the couch with her shoes still on, which she didn't usually do. "We'll see." "You sound different," Ruth said. "Different how?" Ruth was quiet for a moment in the particular way she was quiet when she was choosing her words carefully. "Less like someone who's been holding their breath," she said. Claire thought about that. Outside the apartment window, the city was doing what it always did at this hour, producing noise and light in the specific combination that told you that things were still moving, that people were still going somewhere, that the machinery of ordinary life was continuing without you needing to supervise it. "Mom," she said. "Did you know? When I was married, did you know it wasn't right?" Ruth took her time. "I knew you worked very hard at it," she said carefully. "That's not the same as knowing it wasn't right." "No," Ruth said, "but it tells you something." They talked for another 20 minutes about smaller things. Her mother's neighbor's ongoing conflict with their homeowners association, a trip Ruth was considering to see Claire's aunt in the spring, whether Claire was eating properly, which was a question Ruth had asked since Claire was 19 and would probably ask until one of them died. Claire said she was eating fine. Ruth said that people who are eating fine don't usually say it with that particular tone of voice. Claire said goodnight. She sat on the couch after the call with the shoes still on and thought about what her mother had said. You worked very hard at it. She had. She'd worked at the marriage the way she worked at everything, with attention and method and the belief that if you applied the right effort to the right problems, you could hold a thing together. What she hadn't understood until she was past the middle of it was that you couldn't will a marriage into being what it needed to be through unilateral effort. You could build a business that way. A building would hold the work you put into it. A person who had stopped choosing you would not. She knew that now with a clarity that was not painful the way it had been. It was just true. She'd learned it the hard way, and she knew it, and it had cost her something real, and what she had in exchange was a version of herself that was less likely to make that particular mistake again. She took her shoes off and put them by the door and went to the kitchen and made herself dinner. Actual dinner, not delivery, not crackers over the sink, and ate it at the kitchen table with the Fenmore documentation open beside her plate, because the community liaison outreach needed a plan, and she wanted to have the beginning of one before tomorrow. She was not entirely fine most days. There were still mornings when the apartment felt like what it was, which was a place she lived alone that had taken some adjustment to call home. There were still moments when the weight of everything she'd built pressed down rather than held her up, when the Westfield timeline and the Fenmore structure and the Hargrove residuals and the 23 properties all sat on her chest at 2 a.m. and asked her whether she was sure she could carry all of it. She wasn't always sure. She carried it anyway. But that evening, at the kitchen table with the Fenmore file open and the dinner going warm in front of her, she felt something that she recognized as the particular satisfaction of having made a correct decision. Not a perfect one, not a comfortable one, but a correct one. She'd said yes to the Fenmore partnership because it was the right project with the right person and the right intentions behind it. She'd taken 4 months because 4 months was what it took to be sure. She'd asked the 14 questions and listened to the answers and noticed the underlining in the document and made a decision based on evidence and her own judgment, which was the only basis she trusted. She'd done that same thing 14 months ago in a different context. She'd gathered the evidence and listened to what it told her and made the decision and executed it cleanly. The outcomes were different. One had ended something. One was beginning something. But the process was the same, and the process was hers, and it had not failed her yet. She turned a page in the Fenmore file. She ate her dinner. The city continued outside the window, producing its ordinary noise. She had work to do in the morning, and she was, on balance, looking forward to it. The Westfield development opened on a Thursday in late October, 2 years and 3 weeks after Claire had stood on the courthouse steps and watched a limousine pull away from the curb. It didn't open the way developments open in press releases, with a ribbon cutting and a crowd and a mayor saying things that sound meaningful and mean approximately nothing. It opened the way real things open, which is gradually and imperfectly, with the first 12 residential units occupied by families who had been on the wait list for 7 months, and a leasing office that was still waiting on a final permit for the commercial strip signage, and a community room that was fully functional but had a ceiling light fixture in the northeast corner that kept flickering and that the electrician had been out to look at twice without conclusively fixing. Claire walked through the building on the morning of that Thursday with Carl Pruitt, who had been on the Westfield site for the better part of 2 years, and who walked through it now with the proprietary satisfaction of a man whose work was standing up and holding people inside it. He pointed out things she already knew: the modified foundation in the northeastern quadrant, invisible now under concrete and flooring, and the ordinary life of a building being lived in, and things she hadn't fully registered from the plans, like the way the natural light came through the eastern corridor windows in the morning and made the hallway something better than functional. "It's a good building," Carl said. "Not extravagantly, just as a professional assessment." "It is," she agreed. They stood in the community room for a moment. 2 children from one of the occupied units were already in there, chasing each other around the folding tables that hadn't been fully arranged yet. Their mother was in the doorway watching them with the particular alertness of a parent who is simultaneously relaxed and ready to intervene. And she looked up when Claire and Carl came in and said, "Sorry, I hope it's okay they're in here." "It's exactly what it's here for," Claire said. The woman smiled. Her name, Claire would learn later from Lena's resident files, was Patricia Odom. She'd been on the Westfield waitlist since before ground had broken, had been living with her 2 kids and her sister in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Callaway district that was too small and too expensive and too far from the school her older child attended. She was 34 and worked as a medical billing specialist and had applied for the Westfield affordable unit with the resigned thoroughness of someone who doesn't expect to get the thing they're applying for but applies anyway because not applying guarantees the outcome. She'd gotten the unit. 3rd floor, 2 bedrooms, east-facing windows that caught the morning light that Carl had just pointed out. Her kids were currently running in circles around the community room folding tables. Claire watched them for a moment without saying anything. Carl, who was not a sentimental man and wore it as a kind of honor, cleared his throat and said something about checking on the signage permit status and left. Claire stood in the doorway of the community room for a moment longer. The flickering light in the northeast corner buzzed once and then steadied. The children continued their circuit around the tables. Patricia Odom watched them with her arms crossed, not tightly, just the casual self-containment of someone comfortable in their own body. She had the look of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had recently set it down and hadn't fully processed the absence of the weight yet. Claire knew that feeling. She left the building and went to work. The Hartwell Regional Development Conference happened in the 2nd week of November at the Convention Center on Mercer Boulevard. The same conference where 2 years ago she'd sat across from Adrian Brooks during a panel discussion, and he'd asked the question that had started all of this. She was not a panelist this time. She was the opening keynote. Lena had managed the logistics with her characteristic efficiency, and Sandra had reviewed the remarks for anything that touched on Meridian's public disclosures, and Raymond had made one small suggestion about the financial data she was referencing that she'd incorporated and not mentioned, because it was a good suggestion, and that was sufficient reason to use it. She'd written the remarks herself, in 3 drafts over 2 weeks. In the mornings before her workday started, at the kitchen table with coffee and the particular quiet of early hours that felt like time she'd carved out from the rest of the day specifically for thinking. She was not a natural public speaker in the sense of someone who enjoyed it. She was capable of it, which was different. She said what she meant with precision, and she didn't perform, and she didn't fill silence with words she hadn't decided on yet, which gave her a platform presence that read as authority even when she found the room's attention on her slightly uncomfortable. The convention center held approximately 400 seats and was at capacity. She was told this by the conference coordinator with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested it was exceptional, and she thanked him and did not mention that she'd been too focused on the remarks to think about the room size. She'd stood backstage for 10 minutes before her introduction, going through the remarks in her head not to rehearse them, but to confirm that they still said what she meant them to say. They did. The introduction was longer than she would have chosen for herself. The conference organizer, a brisk woman named Helen Garza, who ran the event with the focused energy of someone who had done this for 15 years and still cared about it, described Meridian Property Group's growth, the Westfield development, the Fenmore partnership with Brooks Development, and a charitable initiative that Meridian had announced the previous month, a housing access fund that would provide direct financial support to first-time renters facing security deposit barriers in the Callaway and Fenmore districts. The fund had been capitalized with $2 million, half from Meridian and half from Brooks Development, and was administered through the regional credit union that had been Claire's partner at the Northgate community. Helen said all of this efficiently and accurately. Claire listened to it from the side of the stage with her hands loose at her sides and thought about how strange it was to hear the arc of your own work described in the compressed version that fits in a 3-minute introduction, stripped of all the Tuesdays and the cold site visits and the 14 questions and the phone calls to Raymond at inconvenient hours and the mechanics' liens and the ceiling lights that flickered. She walked to the podium. "I want to start," she said, "by telling you about a building on Callaway Avenue that needed a new roof and a plumbing overhaul and 3 vacant units filled, and why I bought it anyway." The event ran for 2 days. On the morning of the second day, during the networking reception that preceded the afternoon panels, Claire was standing near the coffee service talking to a municipal planning officer named James Chow about the Fenmore permit timeline when she saw Ethan. She saw him before he saw her, which gave her approximately 4 seconds to decide what she was going to do with the fact that he was there. He was working. That was clear immediately. He was in a white service uniform, moving through the reception with a tray of pastries, navigating the crowd with the practiced invisibility that service staff develop in rooms full of people who don't look at them. She didn't stop what she was saying to James Chow. She finished her sentence about the permit timeline, made a note to follow up with his office about the revised drainage documentation, and thanked him for his time. He moved on toward another conversation. She looked at Ethan again. He was across the room now, offering the tray to a cluster of attendees who took what they wanted without looking at him. She didn't feel what she would have expected to feel 2 years ago, which was the complicated tangle of anger and grief and the residual sting of humiliation. She felt something considerably simpler, which was the recognition of a person who had once been central to her life and was now peripheral to it, not through cruelty or decision, but through the natural consequence of everything that had happened between the courthouse and this convention center. She registered his presence the way you register the presence of someone you knew a long time ago in a place you no longer live, with the mild, factual clarity of distance. He saw her when he was about 20 feet away. She watched it happen, the moment of recognition, the particular stillness that moved through him, the tray steadied in both hands with sudden care. He looked like someone who had just discovered a fact he wasn't prepared for and was trying to decide what to do with it. She walked toward him, not because she needed to, not because she had anything to say that required saying, but because the alternative, maneuvering around the room to avoid a 2-minute encounter with a man she had finished grieving, was the behavior of someone who hadn't finished grieving, and she had. "Ethan," she said when she reached him. Evenly. The way you say the name of someone you've known long enough to say it without weight. "Claire." His voice was careful. The tray was still in his hands. He looked at her the way people look when they're trying to find the appropriate register for a situation that has no obvious template. "I didn't know you'd be speaking here." "Opening keynote," she said. "I didn't know you were working the event." Yeah." He glanced around the room briefly, the small, involuntary movement of someone mildly aware of the optics of their circumstances. "I've been doing some catering work. The sales position changed, and I've been figuring out the next thing." She looked at him. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who had been dealing with practical difficulties for long enough that the tiredness had become a baseline. He was still put together. The white uniform was clean, the jaw was shaved, but there was something behind the surface of him that was less certain than it had been in that courthouse hallway 2 years ago. Less certain, and possibly more honest for it. "I hope the next thing comes together," she said, and she meant it in the simple, uncomplicated way of wishing someone a workable life. Not warmly, not coldly, just honestly. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't fully name. Not quite regret, or maybe it was regret. just a version of it that had run out of anywhere to go. You were always better at this than me, he said. All of it. I think I knew that, and I just... He stopped. I don't know what I just... She let the silence sit for a moment. She didn't need to fill it, and she didn't. Take care of yourself, she said. She reached into the small portfolio she was carrying and found a folded bill. A 20, the first denomination her fingers found, and set it on the edge of his tray. Not as a gesture, not as a statement. He had been working. She was at an event where you tipped service staff, and it was the thing you did. He looked at the bill on the tray, and then at her, and she was already turning back toward the room, toward Adrian, who was crossing the floor in her direction with his jacket on, and the relaxed forward attention he brought to rooms full of people, the kind of man who moved through a crowd as though he genuinely liked the people in it. Ready? He said when he reached her. They had the afternoon panel to attend and a dinner afterward with 3 potential municipal partners for the Fenmore project, and the morning had already been long. Ready? She said. He offered his arm in the easy, unforced way he did things. No performance behind it, just the natural gesture of a person comfortable with the person beside them. And they moved through the room together. She did not look back at Ethan. It would be easy to say that the moment at the convention center was the ending. The clean, cinematic beat where the woman who was underestimated walks away with the better man toward the better life, and the one who underestimated her is left holding a tray. Stories want to end that way. They want a tableau, a visual that locks the meaning into a single frame. But that wasn't quite how it was. Life doesn't cooperate with tableaus. The dinner that evening with the municipal partners ran long and produced 2 promising leads and 1 complication involving a zoning variance that would need resolution before the Fenmore commercial component could proceed as designed, which meant another round of planning office correspondence and another item for Lena's whiteboard, and another Tuesday that would be consumed by something that had not been on the original timeline. That was the texture of the work. That was always the texture of the work. Adrian drove her home afterward, which he'd started doing with enough regularity that it was a pattern. Now, a comfortable one, the kind that builds without being formally decided. He parked on the street outside her building and left the engine running, the heat on, and they sat for a few minutes talking about the zoning issue, and then not talking about the zoning issue, and then not talking about much, the radio going low in the background with the jazz station he kept on when he was driving at night. "How are you?" he asked. Not about the zoning variance, not about the municipal leads. "It was a long day," she said. "I know. How are you?" She looked out at the street. The city at 11 on a November night had its own particular quality. Fewer people, different light, the sense of a place breathing out after the effort of the day. She'd always liked the city at this hour, the way it became a different, quieter version of itself without losing what it was. "I saw Ethan today," she said, at the reception. Adrian was quiet for a moment. He knew the broad outline, not the granular version, and he'd never pressed her for more than she offered. "How was that?" "Fine," she said. And she meant it the same way she'd meant it 2 years ago in the courthouse hallway, except that now the distance between the word and the truth was smaller. Now they were nearly the same thing. "It was just fine. He looked tired. I gave him a tip and walked away." Adrian absorbed this without trying to interpret it for her. That was something she'd come to trust about him. The absence of interpretive interference, the willingness to let things be what they were without improving them. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm okay." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the particular attention he brought to things he actually cared about, which was not everything, which was part of why it meant something when he aimed it at her. "I don't feel what I expected to feel when I imagined running into him." "What did you expect to feel?" "I don't know, something bigger. Satisfaction, maybe, or the last remnant of something unresolved." She looked back at the street. "I just felt done. Like looking at a chapter of a book you finished a long time ago. You remember reading it, but you're not in it anymore." Adrian nodded slowly. "That's not nothing," he said. "Getting to done is the work." She thought about that. He was right, in the way that true things are right. Not neat or decorative, just accurate. Getting to done was the work. Not the arrival, Not the moment of formal closure in a courtroom or a convention center hallway, but the years of actual living in the direction you'd chosen until the former life receded to the appropriate distance and the current one took up its proper amount of space. She'd done that work. She was still doing it, in the daily, unglamorous sense of showing up to the things that mattered and making the decisions that needed to be made and caring about the details that deserved care. The Westfield community room with the flickering light. Patricia Odom's kids running circles around the folding tables. Darlene's comment underlined in a planning document. 14 questions in 4 months and the slow assembly of a trust that was real because it had been earned. None of it was smooth. The Fenmore zoning variance was going to eat a month she didn't have to spare. The Hargrove building still had 2 units with deferred maintenance that Marcus had flagged twice and that needed attention before winter. Her mother was planning a spring trip to see her aunt and had mentioned, in the particular indirect way she mentioned things she cared about, that it would be nice if Claire could join for part of it, and Claire had said she'd look at her schedule and hadn't looked yet. Raymond had sent her an email that afternoon about a potential acquisition in the Millfield district that was interesting and premature, and that she needed to give him an actual answer on instead of the vague acknowledgement she'd sent back from the convention center lobby. Life was not an arrival. It was an ongoing set of obligations and decisions and small, unglamorous acts of attention, and you got to call it yours if you were honest about what it required and willing to provide it. But tonight, in the car outside her building with the jazz low on the radio and the city breathing out into the dark, she felt the particular quality of contentment that doesn't require perfection, the satisfaction of having moved in the direction of her own values for long enough that the direction felt like home. "Come up for coffee?" she said to Adrian. He glanced at the time on the dashboard. "It's almost midnight." "I know what time it is." He looked at her. He smiled. The real one, not the professional one. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." They went upstairs. She made coffee that was too strong because she always made it too strong and had stopped apologizing for it, and they sat at the kitchen table with the Fenmore documentation between them, and they talked about the zoning variance with the unhurried focus of 2 people who both cared about the same problem and had the energy to think about it clearly even at midnight, which was either a mark of dedication or a personality flaw they shared, and either way, it was theirs. It was not a perfect evening. He knocked over his coffee at one point, not badly, but enough to require attention, and her notes got slightly damp on one corner, and she was annoyed about it for longer than was warranted, and he wiped the table without making anything of it, which helped. They didn't resolve the zoning variance that night. You don't resolve a municipal planning complication over coffee at midnight. You just think about it more clearly and write down the questions that need answering, which is a different but necessary thing. He left at 1:15. She stood in the doorway for a moment after he'd gone down the hall and listened to the elevator, and then closed the door and stood in the apartment in the quiet. It occurred to her, standing there, that she had not thought about Ethan Cross since the car. Not since the parking lot, not during the coffee, not while they were working through the zoning question. He had come up once, in the conversation she'd initiated, and then he'd receded back to the appropriate distance. This was not something she'd achieved. It was something that had happened, incrementally, through 2 years of putting her energy into things that were alive and growing rather than things that were finished. You don't decide to stop carrying the weight of a marriage that failed. You get busy with something real, and you look up one day and it's lighter, and then lighter again, and then one day you're standing in your kitchen at 1 a.m. and you realize you haven't thought about it in hours. She went to bed. She slept without difficulty, which she had not always been able to do, and which she did not take for granted. In the weeks after the conference, the Housing Access Fund, the $2 million initiative that Helen Garza had described from the convention center podium, began receiving applications. Lena managed the intake process with the credit union, and the first disbursements went out before December. The amounts were not large individually: security deposit assistance, first month's rent support, the financial gap between a family that could sustain rent and a family that couldn't get through the door. But the applications were real, and the need behind them was real, and the money went where it was supposed to go and did what it was supposed to do. One of the early applicants was a woman named Sandra, not Claire's Sandra, a different woman, 27 years old with a 4-year-old daughter, working 2 jobs, trying to move from a shelter situation into a stable apartment she'd been approved for but couldn't fund the deposit on. The application came through the standard process. Lena reviewed it with the credit union liaison, and it was approved within the normal timeline. The disbursement went out. Claire didn't know about this specific application. She knew about the fund and the process and the disbursement rate, which she reviewed monthly in the summary Raymond prepared. She didn't know Sandra's name or her daughter's name or what the apartment looked like. That was appropriate. That was the whole point of building something that didn't require her personal attention on every transaction. That it could do the work on the days she was focused on the zoning variance or the Westfield lighting fixture or the Millfield acquisition she still owed Raymond a real answer about. She'd learned this from Eleanor, who had built a property management company that ran itself well enough to keep running through 30 years and 100 practical complications and the death of the person who built it. You built the thing right, and you built it to outlast your own presence in any given moment. That was the inheritance, not the money. The money was a means. The inheritance was the understanding that what you build with your time and attention and judgment is the only real measure of the life you've lived, not what you were given, not what you accumulated, what you built, and what it was actually for. And whether the people it was built to serve could feel the difference between something made with real care and something made to fill a requirement. Claire had spent 2 years learning the full weight of that understanding. The Westfield community room where Patricia Odom's kids ran circles around folding tables. The Fenmore Housing Fund that was putting people through doors they couldn't have opened otherwise. 26 properties in 4 districts, managed with the attention to detail that her grandmother had maintained for 30 years, and that Claire had learned, first by watching and then by doing, was the only way to do it. She was 43 years old. She had a portfolio that was larger and more complex than anything Eleanor had imagined when she'd handed over Marsh Holdings and a set of principles and the specific advice never to show what you had until you knew what you were dealing with. She had a partnership with a man who had underlined Darlene's comment and asked smart questions and knocked over his coffee at her kitchen table and didn't make a thing of it. She had a mother who wanted her to come on part of a spring trip, and a city she had put real work into, and a whiteboard in an 11th floor office with a week's worth of problems on it that required her attention and her judgment and her willingness to ask the next question. She was not finished. She was not particularly close to finished. She had things she hadn't figured out yet, about the work, about what she wanted from the life around the work, about the specific shape that the next years would take. And she was not troubled by the unfinishedness of it the way she once might have been. Unfinished was just the condition of a life that was still going somewhere. What she knew, what she had earned the right to know, was that the woman who had walked out of that courthouse 2 years ago with a paper coffee cup and a portfolio case and a limousine at the curb had not been lucky, had not been rescued, had not been waiting for the right moment or the right person or the right set of circumstances to begin. She had already begun, years before anyone saw it. Years before the limousine, before the Westfield groundbreaking, before the keynote address and the Fenmore partnership and the housing fund and all of it. She had begun in a fireproof cabinet in her grandmother's house on Mercer Lane, in a set of principles handed to her by a difficult woman who understood money as a form of freedom and freedom as something you built for yourself because no one was coming to build it for you. The greatest thing Claire Bennett had done was not become richer than the man who had underestimated her, though that had happened. It was not building a company that appeared in regional business journals or standing at a podium in front of 400 people in a convention center. It was the slower, less visible, considerably less photographable work of becoming a person whose life belonged entirely to herself, whose choices were her own, whose values were enacted rather than stated, whose idea of what a good day looked like had nothing to do with anyone else's approval of it. Ethan Cross was somewhere in the city tonight with his tray and his tiredness and whatever version of the next thing he was assembling from the pieces of the life he'd made. She hoped it went better for him than the last version had. She meant that without irony and without satisfaction. He was a man who had made choices and was living inside them, the same as everyone, and she had run out of the energy it takes to want things to go badly for someone even when they deserve it, because that energy is heavy and she had better uses for it. She thought about him for the last time for a while on a Wednesday morning in December, standing at the window of the Meridian office with coffee in her hand and the city going about its business below her. She thought about the courthouse hallway and his particular laugh, and the limousine pulling away from the curb, and his face in the moment he saw it. She thought about the convention center tray, and the $20 bill, and the 4 seconds she'd had to decide what to do with the fact of him in the room. She'd decided to walk toward it. She'd finished it and walked toward Adrian and the rest of the afternoon and the zoning variants and the midnight coffee and all the unremarkable, necessary, genuinely hers material of her actual life. She turned away from the window. Lena was at her desk. The whiteboard had a new week's worth of problems on it. The Millfield acquisition file was on the corner of her desk, and Raymond needed an answer, and she was ready to give him one. She set down her coffee and picked up a marker and went to the board. She had work to do, and she was, still and always, the person who did it.